Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for joining today's webinar presentation from Real Story Group. This is one of our most exciting webinars for the year, and it's something that we really look forward to. And typically, it's one of our most highly attended presentations of the year, and that's certainly the case today. So, thanks for joining today's session on the latest rendition of our MarTech vendor map. My name is Scott Dill. I'm on the business development team here with Real Story Group, and as you see, our founder and CEO, Tony Byrne, is with us as well. I'm only going to take us through the majority of today's session, but I'll get us started with a couple of quick housekeeping items of note. You will be able to get these slides after today's session, so those should be available in the next couple of days from our site. And then for our subscribers on the line, you'll also be able to access a recording of this presentation anytime through your subscriber library. So stay tuned for that. We'll also have time for questions at the end. So if you do have any questions, feedback, anecdotes you'd like to share, you can do so in the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. We do see a lot of new folks on the line today, so welcome. And just to give you a quick little background about Real Story Group, we've been at this now for over 20 years. And when Tony started this company, he did so along the lines of a consumer report where we'll never work for or advise the vendors that we cover in any way. Our only focus is on technology users and buyers and giving you the real story about what these vendors do well, but also what they don't do so well and where they might fall short for you. So we're certainly going to pull no punches in describing to you what's going to be the right fit for what it is that you're trying to do. So you'll notice during Tony's presentation that he's certainly going to take a no BS approach to how he talks about the vendors, but also the trends that we're seeing out in the marketplace, which is the theme for today's session, which is the latest themes that go along with the MarTech vendor map that we'll show you here in a moment. So Tony, I'll send things over to you to take it away.
Great, thanks Scott. This is one of my favorite times of the year, mid-June, which is when we release an update to our subway map, which is all the vendors we're covering and in some cases not covering and why. And so I'm trying to see if we can't tell a bigger story with the map and the associated reference model. And so I'm going to talk about 4 topics here after I introduce the new map. First is this kind of persistence of concentration and fragmentation in these marketplaces. We'll kind of turn the map on its side and look at the latest stack model, like how do these pieces stack together. And we'll talk about the newest subway line, which is the e-commerce line, and how does that then relate to MarTech. And then we'll close out with some thoughts on data, content, and decisioning. What's actually going on here? What are your peers doing? And what does that mean for these marketplaces? Particularly some changes in these marketplaces over the last year or so. Okay, so let's jump into it. This is the latest MarTech stack vendor map. It's busier than ever. We now have 10 lines on this map. We're covering 10 technology segments. And it's becoming cartographically, I'll say, a bit of a challenge, and also color graphically as well. We've got a couple of different purples, a couple of different greens, a couple of different blues, but hopefully it makes sense that each one of these marketplaces, starting with web content and experience management, digital asset management, outbound marketing platforms, marketing attribution, customer data platform, journey orchestration engines, omnichannel operations hubs, omnichannel content platforms, personalization platforms, and the new this year for us is e-commerce platforms. So a lot of vendors out there. These are the ones that we think are the most significant for our typically somewhat larger enterprise subscriber and client base. We don't purport to be like the Scott Brinker mega chart that lists every last, now up to 10,000 different players. We try to see if we can't distill down what are the most significant ones and what are the relationships among them. And so that kind of makes the map kind of interesting because you can see there's some single line vendors and then there's these multi-stations with multiple lines going through them. So let's talk next about what's going on there, concentration and fragmentation, or rather fragmentation and concentration. So fragmentation is in analyst speak for there are a heck of a lot of vendors in many, if not most, of these categories. That means a lot of stations, for example, on CDP. The orange line here, I think we cover close to 30 vendors. I think we're adding a couple more this quarter even. So you see that the orange line starts over at the left, a lot of now fairly healthy and viable pure play vendors, and then it goes through the city center where a lot of other vendor names you'd recognize like Microsoft, Adobe, Oracle, Twilio have acquired or built their own platforms, and then off to the right you see this periphery again. So we have this kind of center and periphery thing that's going on. It's been going on really for the last 15 years that we've been doing this map in one way or another. And so a lot of the innovation is obviously happening at the periphery. And on the other hand, there's a lot of, there is a kind of a center of gravity, if only with respect to branding and marketing, when you have the likes of Adobe, Oracle, Salesforce, Acquia, certainly SAP, to some extent Sitecore, in this mix, right? So you have this kind of classic choice today, as it was in the last couple of decades, about whether you align with the multiple products of a particular vendor or you build what we call a composable stack. I think a lot of you know our opinions on this. They are opinions rather than bias, I would say, because it's based on our experience talking to people like you and working with people like you, that we look at the city center, somewhat askance, that you have, some significant issues with some of these vendors. So, there's Adobe, Oracle, Salesforce. If you look at the upper right, SAP should really be here cartographically. We couldn't quite squeeze them in. Those four certainly dominate a lot of conversations. You have some aging solutions in Aprimo and Acoustic, some challengers like Optimizely and Acquia and to some extent Sitecore and others. And then what's interesting is, OpenText, which used to be active in some of these areas, has more or less, fallen out. It's kind of a graveyard, or we actually call it a retirement home for aging platforms. And then what's interesting as well, and this has been a consistent theme, especially for the last, I'd say, 5 years, is how much Microsoft has not tipped its, put its toes into this water. You do have Microsoft Dynamics, the CRM, and then on top of that, they built some marketing services, some outbound marketing services, and underneath it, they built a CDP. But otherwise, Microsoft has stayed very enterprisey and has tended to stay out of this space, which is interesting, and has created, to some extent, a vacuum for others to come through. Of course, with Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, you have the cloud play, right? And so their cloud infrastructure drives a lot of these services. So it's not like they're not making money off MarTech. They're just not necessarily selling a lot of MarTech solutions themselves. So, how do we interpret this? Well, I think we're of the mind that there have been questions, and these questions have become increasingly urgent over the last 5 years around whether some of these vendors in the city center are actually too big. They can be difficult to navigate even for their own internal people. There are various product misdirections that happen where they acquire a lot of different technology that are often running on, in the case of Salesforce, 4 or 5 different clouds. Ditto for Adobe. They tend to be more developer intensive and have higher than average technical debt, and so that tends to then drive poorer long-term total cost of ownership and reduced agility. So that doesn't mean that these vendors flat out suck and you should never use them. I think that there is some value as potential anchor tenants that, Adobe Analytics is an excellent platform if it's properly resourced. Salesforce Sales Cloud certainly has an amazing ecosystem, even if there's a lot of technical debt underneath it. And so we sometimes talk about a MarTech mall, and some of these platforms might be useful as kind of anchor tenants. But what's interesting about this is that they have been slower to adapt to this sort of omni-channel world that I'm going to talk about in a minute. And so There are potentially opportunities to replace some of their services with more lighter weight, in some cases more modern services, particularly at the engagement tier. But in any case, you never want to default to a lateral solution from the same vendor. And I'd say this about any vendor, that just because you get service X from vendor Y doesn't mean you should get service Z from vendor Y, right? That you ought to stack it up. And it could be that it integrates so much better that it makes sense for you. But in many cases, you have to remember these suites were assembled willy-nilly, often not even due for technical compatibility. And so the integration benefits very often don't, outweigh some of the functional misfits that you have. But in any case, don't default to a solution just because it comes from an incumbent vendor. And the larger story here is this notion of a composable stack, that you need to own your stack, that you don't sort of outsource it either to a consulting firm that's telling you what to do, or or for that matter, a vendor strategy and a vendor acquisition strategy. Individual technology platforms can be omnichannel in some respects, but a vendor's not omnichannel. Your stack can be omnichannel. Your stack can be composable, but you have to take responsibility for composing it. So what does that look like? And this is a very common question that we've gotten over the years. We see the subway map, we say, okay, that's great. It's a flat representation, a two-dimensional representation of the marketplaces, but how do these pieces all relate in my own environment? And so over the years, we've developed different stack reference models. We had one in the 2010s, and now we have one for the 2020s that we're always in the process of refining. This is the latest version, and the colors more or less line up with the colors of the subway map. Many of you have seen this before. I'll give you a really brief tour of it. That you have engagement channels at the top. Those channels seem to proliferate every couple of years. The pandemic rearranged the way a lot of your customers and partners and others wanted to engage with you. So that's been an area of great ferment. You have a variety of interaction and delivery environments. And then you have these engagement services. So that's where historically in the 2010s, a lot of you spent a lot of time modernizing those engagement services. And our reference model certainly focused a lot on those. And that's not bad, but the problem was that these were very vertically integrated solutions that had their own content, their own data, their own decisioning. And so it left a lot of silos within the enterprise where you weren't having coherent customer experiences across these different channels. So our theory about what is transpiring and what you ought to think about accelerating in the 2020s, this investment in what we call enterprise foundation services. And they're decoupled from any specific engagement service or engagement channel so that you can have coherency across your channels and you can scale over time. And so the enterprise foundation services typically fall into three categories of services: content and information, the column over on the left, in the center, data services, and then over on the right, decisioning services. So most of you are in the early stages of this. This is a reference model, right? So first of all, this one is a little bit more B2B oriented. Other cases might be more B2C. And so when we're working with our subscribers, typically we modify this. But the general idea is that no one has gotten here yet, but everyone, it seems like all the organizations we're working with are beginning to kind of get this and are beginning to move there. And so it's just a question of, what do you prioritize and how do you get there? And it's also important to understand that these are services. So for some of you, you may have multiple logos in one box in your stack. Others of you may have one logo that's covering multiple boxes. So we see that, for example, very often in the customer data platform or CDP marketplace, where it may be your CDP services may be providing capabilities across 4 of these boxes. And where that makes sense, that's not necessarily a bad thing. So it's not always a one-to-one relationship between vendor, platform, and service here. But the key thing is that this is a composable stack. It's built for flexibility. And it's built for adaptation, and it's built for long-term growth, and it's built for an omnichannel customer-first experience strategy. So you saw one of the new boxes that we put in our reference model this year, and the new line on our subway map is e-commerce. And so I think the first question that gets begged here is, why did we add e-commerce? And there's a pretty simple answer to that. Our advisory council, our council of senior MarTech executives at companies like yours, asked us to, because they were seeing a growing intersection between their work in marketing and CX and DX technology and e-commerce. And, you know, at the edge of the pandemic back in 2020, everyone had an e-commerce plan. Everyone did. But what the pandemic did was accelerate everybody's e-commerce plan. And again, customers showing up in unusual places and through unusual venues, it just kind of scrambled everything. And so there's been a redoubling of e-commerce efforts. And what this has also then brought to bear has become a blurrier line between MarTech and e-commerce. So let's talk about that for a minute here. Some of you may remember this famous cover image from the New Yorker some decades back, which was a New Yorker's view of the world. And you can see, you know, a very micro view of East Manhattan and the Hudson River and Jersey and Kansas City, and then Los Angeles off in the distance. And, you know, the implied joke here is a kind of myopia. And I think that many enterprise initiatives start out this way, and certainly e-commerce was, where I had to find an e-commerce platform, build almost a kind of e-commerce stack around it, and I could live more or less self-sufficiently from, you know, the rest of my enterprise, although obviously some integration here and there is required. And on the MarTech side, okay, maybe e-commerce was New York. On the MarTech side, maybe, you know, we were New Jersey and having our own sort of view of the world, that e-commerce was out there somewhere, you know, past the Princeton Township, and one of those interesting things we needed to think about, but we were very focused on MarTech. And the reality is nobody really has that luxury anymore. And so what's happening here? We got a question the other day, does this mean that there's a convergence of e-commerce and MarTech? And I actually don't think so. I don't think from a technology standpoint, they're still two very distinct domains. And in fact, vendors who purport to say, okay, I've got a CMS and then also buy my commerce platform, it's like, oh, come on. You know, the two, do they need to integrate? Sure, of course. But do you need to get it from the same vendor? Probably not. So it's not necessarily a convergence of technology, but it's more that if we're taking a customer experience view of it, then we need to be thinking about longer journeys, about commerce in the context of some sort of flow or user experience. We're starting to see a kind of evaporation of the boundary of this is an e-commerce site and this is a website. People are wanting to do more embedded e-commerce upstream and downstream. They're wanting to inject more unstructured content into commerce experience. They want to make sure that their commerce view of a customer is the same as their marketing view of the customer with respect to the data that they know about them, such that if marketer says you're a VIP because you have very high lifetime value, when that person gets to the e-commerce site, you don't want to treat them as as a schmuck. You want them to be treated like a VIP, right? So they have to have the same view of the customer data as well. And so this is driving some overlap in terms of both needing to address a lot of the same issues and a desire to create some shared resources. So let's talk about that for a minute. And what we're seeing among some of the more forward-looking enterprises is they're saying, look, I already need these omnichannel content services and digital asset management for my marketing purposes. I already need customer data, unified view of the customer data, and I've got some test and optimization and maybe some recommendation services here. Maybe rather than use what's built in with my e-commerce engine, I can use some enterprise standard capabilities and inject those into my e-commerce environment. Now, that's easier said than done in many cases, and particularly with some of the legacy e-commerce vendors that tend to want to do this stuff themselves and create their own kind of mini customer data stack, their own catalog, their own decisioning algorithms and all of that. But we're beginning to see a kind of a shift where marketing and e-commerce are sharing some of these underlying information data and decisioning services and creating much more expansive and consistent customer experiences that way. So let's talk briefly about the e-commerce vendor landscape. Again, it's kind of city center and then some really interesting independents. The city center are suite vendors that have been in this space for a while, have made quite a few acquisitions to round out their platforms. Tendency for fairly highly coupled solutions and a lot of technical debt there, so you need to be careful with them. The independents tend to be newer, more interesting. The three at the bottom are so-called more composable and headless commerce, which is interesting, but also requires some work to stitch things together. Shopify has kind of made the leap from being more of a sole proprietor kind of e-commerce toy to really being a legitimate B2C player, particularly for organizations that have multiple stores. So a lot of interesting things happening. If I was a full-blown e-commerce analyst, I would probably point out that there's an e-commerce stack underneath this as well. So once again, I think the view of this is: are you looking at the world from New Jersey? Are you looking at it from New York? Are you looking at it from California? So I think in the future, we're all going to have a more integrated view of these things, and certainly that's what our reference model wants to get you towards. It was really interesting coming up with the e-commerce scenario. So those of you who have worked with us before, you know that when we evaluate vendors, we tend not to evaluate them on a feature basis, but rather through what scenarios are they best and worst fit for, and then what about their strategic intangibles. And so that allows you to mix and match, your needs against what the vendors are good at. And one of the interesting things about the e-commerce market is very similar to the outbound marketing market, in as much as B2B and B2C are very different, right? And so much the same way that major MarTech vendors have a B2B oriented campaign and messaging platform, and then maybe a separate B2C oriented campaign and messaging platform, is totally the same in the e-commerce market. So don't let any e-commerce vendor tell you that they can solve both your problems off of a single code base. Even the so-called headless composable vendors have even had to acquire, those that came out of the B2C space had to acquire B2B components, and vice versa, because they're two very, very different worlds. But then there's other things going on, certainly multi-channel, multi-store, a lot of really interesting capabilities here around distributed commerce as well. In our council meeting tomorrow, we're actually going to get a case study on that, so I'm super excited to see that about distributed commerce in a major B2C enterprise. So fascinating marketplace, but clearly a lot of opportunities here to mix and match capabilities with what you may already be building on the MarTech and CX side. So by the way, this screenshot is from RSG's Real Quadrant Shortlist Generator. So we believe not in magic quadrants, but in real quadrants where you input what's important to you, and then we spit out what might be a right shortlist. So you can go try this on your own. To get access to all the goods, you do need to be a Real Story Group subscriber. Okay. So, by the way, I just wanted to reiterate, we're starting to get a question or two come in, and feel free, if you have any questions or comments or anything you disagree with or an anecdote you'd like to share, feel free to put that in the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will certainly have time to get to it here in about 2 or 3 minutes. Okay. Mention those 3 columns at the bottom of our reference model. Data, content, and decisioning. And I wanted to just share a few observations about what we've seen going on there over the past, past year or so. So here it is again, the reference model. And let's talk about data first. This has been really interesting because our orientation on this has been in evaluating CDP vendors and helping many of our subscribers pick CDP, customer data platforms. And what's interesting about CDP projects is they tend to expose just how messy your customer data is. And it reminds me a little bit of the portal era, maybe, 10, 15, 20 years ago, where portals were just a window into how messed up your your internal environments were and how crappy some of the internal systems were. And it just gave you a better, more unified view of that. And to some extent, the CDP can do that as well. So we're really telling people, one, if this is an area you should probably focus on first. This is table stakes. You have to get this right. And indeed, we've seen that we see a lot more energy in this column than the other two. And I'll talk about that. And that energy is well placed. But instead of just thinking, what CDP do I need? You really need to be thinking about your broader customer data fabric and what are all the different pieces you need. And inevitably, this leads you into sometimes challenging conversations with your enterprise data team. But you have to have those conversations. You have to have that alignment. A CDP itself is not a plug it and fix it type platform. But to the extent that you're working here, I think this is a decade-long program at least, and some of you are 2 or 3 years into that. That's great. Those resources that you're putting against the data part of this problem, those resources are well spent. Somewhat different story on the other two columns. So if we look at content and information, I would say that the most mature area we see is around product information management because people have been doing that for a long time. The problem is that many PIM systems are kind of disconnected from your marketing systems and sometimes even disconnected from your commerce platforms. And so having those be more integrated is really where we all need to get to. Digital asset management. Many of you are in older DAM platforms that can't always work for the omnichannel world. And then there's omnichannel content services, which is the red line on our map, which we call omnichannel content platforms. We really were kind of hoping that these would take off. It's been somewhat slow going, and I think that a lot of enterprises aren't yet ready to deal with composable content, aren't yet ready to decide which content is truly reusable and foundational and which is not. A lot of you have content stuck in your web content management systems and your e-commerce systems, and it's difficult to abstract that out or decouple it away. We do have some enterprises right now making aggressive investments in this area on the notion, I think the correct notion, that this is going to be a strategic competitive advantage for them. But that market has moved very slowly, and I think it speaks in part to the fact that doing composable content is hard. I mean, we've known this since the dawn of SGML, 40 years ago. Composable content is hard. It always will be hard. But we have to start thinking more in that way if we want to have more omnichannel experiences going forward. So there's kind of a similar story on the omnichannel decisioning side, is that we see a lot of decisioning, including like A/B testing, personalization, and any kind of and orchestration tending to be within specific channels. In other words, I'm doing this within my website, I'm doing this within my email platform, I'm doing this in my e-commerce environment, I'm doing this in my call center, and that's good to some extent, to the fact that maybe you got more mature there, but it's not omnichannel, and so you have the problem of lack of coherence. And we started covering journey orchestration platforms about 8 years ago, and we thought that they were really going to take off. And what's interesting about this is that they didn't. So that was not a great prediction on our behalf. And what's happened actually in the last year is that market has kind of imploded. First of all, vendors never got very big. And secondly, almost all the independent ones got snapped up by, customer service or CX platforms. So that was really interesting. And so we have to ask ourselves, why is that? Well, I think there's two things going on. One is we're seeing more effort on personalization. We just started covering personalization technologies last year. And so I think a little bit more energy is focused on personalization and not necessarily biting off the whole omnichannel orchestration enchilada. But some of it, too, is the way that we're structured internally, is that as enterprises, many of you are not mature enough to even make decisions about how you're going to do omnichannel journey orchestration when it has to cross so many organizational silos within your enterprise. Who's in charge? Who owns the customer? Who owns the customer experience? These are really hard problems to solve operationally, particularly since we're still trying to get good at a lot of this stuff just within a particular channel. So we've seen less maturity in the marketplace, and I think a lot of that has to do with less maturity among us. Having said that, we have worked with some members of our council who have been successful with these technologies, and it's partly because of their approach that these technologies are a little bit different than traditional campaign management, where they tend to be more listen and respond. And there's a lot to be said for listening and responding as opposed to just blasting people. And so in the long run, I'm bullish on the concepts underneath experience optimization, omnichannel personalization, and even journey orchestration, which I think has been the least mature of all of these, with respect to meeting the customer where they are rather than where you want them to be. But this area probably has seen much less spend and innovation than the other two columns. Okay, so that brings us back to the map. These are all the vendors that we evaluate today. Next year, being next year, we'll probably drop 5 or 6 of these and add 10 more, and we'll let you know then. For those of you who are not yet engaged with Real Story Group, there's 3 ways that you can work with us. The first one is you can just license access, subscribe to one or more of these streams. And so you get the inside dope on all the vendors on the map in that stream, and we give you this real quadrant decision-making tool so you don't have to read the entire PDF. We slim it down by having you input what's important for you and then spit out some custom research for you. Some enterprises take our second offering, which is kind of a full stack. You get access all you can eat to all of our research, and we're here on call to help you think through some of your own stack decisions about this. And then the subset of those have joined our MarTech Stack Leader Council. We're having our last Zoom meeting tomorrow about the integration of MarTech and eCommerce, and then we're meeting in person in September again, which is fabulous. It's been a couple of years, 2.5 years since we've been able to meet in person. So we'll be meeting in person for a day and a half to go through a pretty broad agenda of just helping each other through common challenges and learning from each other. So if that's of interest, feel free to contact my colleague Scott here. So Scott, you can just talk about next steps. In the meantime, I'll see what questions have come up.
Great, thanks, Tony. And as Tony mentioned, please don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions at all about the research itself or potentially joining the council. We've got some exciting other members within that group, other MarTech stack decision makers. So if that's something you'd like to learn more about, definitely reach out to us. In terms of our webinar schedule, we do have another presentation set for this time next week, where our colleague Jared Jingles will walk through your journey from DAM to omnichannel content management. So hope you can join us for that. And Tony, I'll send it back to you for a couple questions that have come in.
Yeah, and if you have any other questions, feel free to write them in. So James is asking, given the current trend of making decisioning into an enterprise capability versus an e-commerce capability, what types of journey orchestration tools have advantages towards fulfilling on that enterprise-wide need? Well, I would say the ones that are really strongest in decisioning and recommendations, and some are more listening-oriented, which isn't bad. Some are more orchestration, which is integrating with a variety of different platforms and setting off different triggers when someone enters a particular stage. But those that have really focused on decisioning are the ones that are likely to be the most effective with respect to e-commerce recommendations. James has another question. When companies say they want to create a content factory, what are some tips they can follow to shortcut the process? Well, I guess it depends exactly what you mean by content factory. I think taking a more systematic view of your content certainly makes sense. We've published some research that you can look up on that actually came out of some council sessions that we did around thinking about content as a supply chain. Now, you need to be careful here because you don't want to be too transactional about this. Content is richer than that, but the notion of having a kind of a mesh of suppliers and that they go through a particular process and then get used in different ways. So thinking about this, really systematically, I think helps you then sort through, what content needs to be composable, what content is reusable, how are we going to deal with renditions and derivations and all that other stuff. Cecilia would like me to show slide 17 again. Here you go, Cecilia. And I'll make it big here, and hopefully you can still see it. Yeah. So I'll just say this is a reference model, which means it's a generic model. Nobody's stack looks exactly like this. This is more a place that where when we're working with enterprises, we start here and then we say, okay, in your environment, what are the key engagement services? What are the key channels? What would your world look like? So this is a starting point more than anything else. Jennifer is asking, what do you make of Microsoft being such a small player on the map? You know, I don't know what to make of that. It's a choice that they've made. It may not have been a bad choice. I think to some extent they were burned with SharePoint and have been careful about rolling out complex platforms that then get them into trouble. But on the other hand, I think they also got burned by some of their initial investments and acquisitions that they made in the marketing space. The fact that they largely failed with respect to web content management over a decade and a half, I think that they may have felt maybe potentially a little jaded. And these days, you know, with Azure being such a key part of what they're doing, and a lot of their nominal competitors would be actually running in Azure. It's not an unusual situation. It happens with Google too, but I think that they would probably prefer to be an infrastructure player in the MarTech space rather than an application or platform player in the MarTech space. Okay, so with that, we've actually run over about 6 or 7 minutes. Once again, super grateful for the time that you spent with us. Always a pleasure to engage with you and hear a little bit about what's on your mind. So hope to see you again on some other webinar. In the meantime, this is Tony Byrne and Scott Dill signing out. Bye now.